I'm Margaret Brennan in Washington, and this week on Face the Nation, the House passes a massive aid package with tens of billions of dollars for Ukraine, widening the divide within the Republican Party. But is it coming too late to help Ukraine defeat Vladimir Putin? After 6 months of party infighting over aid to Ukraine, Speaker Johnson did an end run around his MAGA conservative critics and worked with Democrats to get a $95 billion package of foreign aid through the House, a move that could cost him his job.
I said these are not normal times. They're not. The world is destabilized and it's a tinderbox.
But will it revive the weary Ukrainian war effort? We'll talk with Senate Intelligence Chair Mark Warner. Plus, we'll hear from Republican Congressman Tom Cole and Senator Dan Sullivan about all this and more. Plus, as former President Trump prepares for opening statements in the New York hush money trial, bad weather kept him off the campaign trail this weekend.
They're saying the weather is really getting bad, really getting bad.
President Biden spent 3 days in a state that's a must-win for him.
You're my ticket to the White House. You, Pennsylvania. No, it's not hyperbole.
We'll talk with that state's Democratic governor, Josh Shapiro. Finally, ahead of Earth Day, what impact is the recent run of extreme weather having on American views on climate change? It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. 6 months to the day after President Biden requested the funding for Ukraine, it has finally passed the House. The $95 billion foreign aid package includes $61 billion for Ukraine and rebuilding U.S. weapons stockpiles, $26 billion in aid for Israel, that includes some humanitarian aid for Palestinians, and $8 billion for parts of the Indo-Pacific region, which includes Taiwan. A bill also forces the Chinese-owned firm ByteDance to sell TikTok or risk a U.S. ban. Speaker Mike Johnson, along with a minority of Republicans, worked with a majority of Democrats to get the Ukraine aid through. That bipartisan effort has made some ultra-conservative House Republicans livid, and they're threatening to remove the Speaker from his job just 6 months after a similar scenario cost Kevin McCarthy the speakership. The Senate is expected to pass the funding bill later this week. We begin today with the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner. Good morning, and good to have you here.
Thank you, Margaret.
So, Senator, $61 billion in aid to Ukraine, about 60% of that stays as an investment into the U.S. industrial base, as I understand it. President Zelensky said this morning on another network, it's important that they get crucial long-range artillery like ATACMS. Is that what this money will pay for? And if so, when will they actually get them?
Well, the great news is this is finally happening. It should have happened 6 months ago. The next best time is right now, this week. We've seen the Ukrainians overperform. If you step back for a moment and think about the fact that for most of my life, most of America's defense forces were focused on Russia, getting this additional equipment as quickly as possible. I hope once this gets to the president by Tuesday or Wednesday, that these shipments will be literally launched with that longer range attack.
By next week.
I hope once the president signs, we've been told that it is the president's signature, making sure Congress does its job, that these materials will be in transit by the end of the week. And on that schedule, what it will do is it's clearly been the case that the Ukrainians' morale has been great, but it's been undermined over the last couple of months when they have been literally given out rationed bullets, 8 to 10 bullets a day, and on artillery shells, Russians 10 to 1. You can't underestimate the Ukrainians' grit, determination, but if they don't have the materials, they can't carry this fight to the
Will
Russians.
they get those long-range artillery?
Yes.
Not just ammunition?
The ATACMS, I believe the administration was prepared over the last couple of months to provide ATACMS. It is written into this legislation.
According to the State Department, China has helped Russia rebuild its defense industrial base, which has an impact on the battlefield as well here. How have they been able to just blow through U.S. sanctions or defy them to help the Russians who are fighting Ukraine?
Well, if we look back again, I think we would all acknowledge that the sanctions regime has not been as tight as we'd have liked to see it. China being the worst offender with direct military support. India, a country I'm very supportive of, but India in terms of purchasing Russian oil, that given that hard currency to Russia for them to go out into the marketplace and acquire arms. It's one of the reasons why I think this package, which the House just passed, we will take up this week, that says we have to be ready to be prepared for our national security interests, not only in Ukraine and Russia, also in terms of military assistance to Israel, but with additional humanitarian aid for the Palestinians who are in such great challenges. And there's about $8 or $9 billion for the Indo-Pacific region because of the concern that we have about China's aggressiveness towards Taiwan. Clearly, the Chinese linkage to Russia, combined with the fact that the Iranians are providing drones, for example, for Russia, and the outlier nation, North Korea. I know the terminology used to be axis of evil. This may be the 2024 axis of evil combination of nations.
And Speaker Johnson has used that language. One of the other things that the House voted to do was move this TikTok bill through. So this would force the Chinese-owned parent company ByteDance to divest it, to sell it, but they have the better part of a year to do so. The Chinese government says they're not going to allow that. ByteDance doesn't want to sell it. So if this just gets stuck in the courts, isn't the reality that TikTok's not going away?
TikTok, 170 million Americans a day, 90 minutes a day.
Right.
That's frankly more than the power of eyes that your network reaches on a daily basis. And that information, and many young people on TikTok get their news. Yeah. The idea that we would give the Communist Party this much of a propaganda tool, as well as the ability to scrape 170 million Americans' personal data, it is a national security risk.
But it is a national security risk, according to the U.S. intelligence community, that has a direct impact potentially on U.S. elections.
On U.S.
TikTok
elections
accounts
this year.
Yeah, targeted candidates from both political parties during the midterm cycle in 2022. That's the worldwide threat assessment.
This is
TikTok's not going away before November.
Well, here is the.
So that means it's an active threat.
There is plenty of creativity on TikTok. There are people that make their living off of TikTok as social influencers. I don't want that to go away. I simply want to make sure that the individuals pulling the strings are not ultimately functionaries of the Communist Party of China.
I understand, but even with this significant bill, the timeline is such that it doesn't take it away as a risk for the election. And it seems the U.S. government is so limited in so many ways when it comes to these election influence efforts.
The timeline of giving this can be a complicated transaction. To give it up to a full year, I think just from a business standpoint, makes sense. The one thing we do have in place, and I'm not putting a whole lot of solace in this, but I was at the Munich Security Conference earlier in the year when all 20 of the major social media companies, including TikTok, including Twitter, X, including Facebook, Google, Amazon, you name it, they have all said they would have a voluntary agreement about disinformation and misinformation in elections, because with artificial intelligence, the ability for people to see this, our images here, maybe having words that we don't speak, ought to scare the dickens out of all of us. And the truth is, these 20 companies have guaranteed a voluntary agreement. They'll take on watermarking, which will indicate it altered content, be willing to take this content down, but the proof's going to be in the pudding. The parliamentary elections in Europe start in less than 60 days. So we're going along with our European partners to say, all right, companies, you promised, show us what you're doing.
So this other measure that was approved as well, Section 702, it's a key surveillance tool, was reauthorized for 2 years instead of 5. Take a listen to what the CIA director told my colleague Norah O'Donnell Friday about how his agency is using this authority.
Its reauthorization, its passage, I think, is a crucial tool to fight fentanyl, because something like 70% of all the successful disruptions of fentanyl traffic moving into the United States that we've been a part of have come directly from intelligence derived from 702.
So these changes to 702, how does it help fight the trafficking of fentanyl? What difference is there?
Let's remember what 702 is. It is the ability for the United States government to surveil, listen in on non-Americans, foreigners who are abroad. And many times the fentanyl drug cartels are being run out of Mexico, many times supplied with basic goods out of China. And this ability to listen in on the bad guys' communications is extraordinarily powerful. Matter of fact, the president gets a daily brief of all of the intelligence hotspots around the world. 60% of what he reads each day is material that comes out of the 702 program. Now, let me be clear. There have been times in the past where particularly the FBI didn't even follow its own rules on making sure that a foreign individual, a foreign terrorist that might be talking to American, that we put appropriate protections on that American.
That led to some of this
Led to
Republican
some of the
criticism.
concern. 5 years ago, the FBI itself was screwing up on 30% of their queries, just meeting their own criteria. We put in place reforms. The screw-up level has dropped from about 30% to less than 1%. We put requirements so that you can no longer do batch queries. We got to make sure FBI agents have to show a national security purpose. If a journalist or a political figure or a religious figure were even to be queried about, you have to get approval from either the director, the deputy director, or head of the National Security Division. We think we've got a very strong reform bill. It's why it passed the Senate.
Senator, so much to talk to you about. Good to have you here in person.
Thank you, Mark.
And we turn now to Alaska Republican Senator Dan Sullivan, who was also here with us. It was a busy weekend here in Washington.
Margaret, good to be back on the show.
So, Senator, this Ukraine aid that finally has moved, President Zelensky was on another network this morning, and he said the U.S. will send a signal with this that this will not be a second Afghanistan. The U.S. will stay with Ukraine. If Donald Trump wins this next election, can you guarantee the U.S. will stay with Ukraine?
Well, listen, I can't guarantee anything, but it's actually good that the President Zelensky mentioned Afghanistan because, Margaret, this gets lost too much. I think we got to look at how we got to the situation of Ukraine. I believe strongly that the weakness coming out of the Biden White House, they cut defense spending, every year in terms of the president's budget. Their energy policies exude weakness, and the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan emboldened Putin to undertake the invasion of Ukraine. So we got to remember kind of broadly, more strategically, where we are. But as you know, I was a supporter of the defense supplemental, and I think it's not just going to be important for Ukraine, as you and I have talked about before. It's going to be really important for the industrial base of America, which has atrophied dramatically. 60% of this bill goes into building weapons, everything from submarines to
in many
155.
Republican districts, too, which is why it was so surprising it took so long to get through that House.
All over the place. So I think it's important. But again, a lot of this in terms of where we are on Ukraine, from my perspective, comes from the weakness of the Biden administration and the president's inability to actually make the case on Ukraine. He's given 2 speeches on Ukraine in the last 2 years, and all his speeches do is kind of villainize another part of the Congress. He hasn't tried to bring people together.
We could have a historical argument for the next hour,
well,
going back years about green lights being given to Vladimir Putin around the world by leaders in many countries.
The history
let's
on
talk
this
about,
is important.
I'm not saying it's not, but let's talk about the future here and the signals being sent. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban met in March with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and then he gave an interview. And in that interview, he said that Trump told him he will not give a penny to fund Ukraine, and that is why the war will end, because Ukraine cannot stand on its own feet. We know he's not a fan of President Zelensky, so why do you think he will be persuaded he might win this election?
Yeah. Well, listen, President Trump put out a statement recently where he thought it was important to support Ukraine. He actually also mentioned the Europeans need to do more. And he actually mentioned something, as I just said, that it was very unlikely the war would have started had he still been in the White House. So
Russia hadn't withdrawn from Ukraine. You know, they'd gone in 2014. So this argument over Trump would have made a difference. It didn't make a difference.
Well, look,
during
I mean,
his
I think, again, the broader issue, particularly between Biden and Trump right now, you know, where are we? Is the world a safer place for the United States and our allies today as it was 4 years ago? I think the answer to that is unequivocally no. But let's get back to your question. I do think that the Republican Party in the House and in the Senate is still very much the peace through strength party. This is the tradition of Republicans. Reagan, the Bush presidencies, Eisenhower, Teddy Roosevelt.
Are you just talking about the Senate or the House? Because there were more Republicans in the House who voted against Ukraine aid than voted for it.
Well, but actually look at some of the other votes. There was a vote, Republicans in the House, 2-1 rejected an amendment to strip funding for Ukraine, 2-1 in the House. And
that was Marjorie Taylor Greene's effort.
Correct. And you know, we'll see what the Senate does this Tuesday on this bill. One of the things that I think the Speaker did a good job on with regard to this legislation is he actually improved it for a whole host of reasons. But I predict that you'll probably see a majority of Senate Republicans supporting this legislation. And like I said, peace through strength. This is important because Donald Trump was part of that tradition very much. You remember President Obama cut defense spending by 25% his second term. He gutted readiness. This is what Democrat presidents do. Biden did it. Obama did it.
I'm going to talk about some of these mixed messages in the House with our congressman ahead, Senator.
But look, I mean, but I still think our party is the peace through strength party. One of the dangers, in my view.
But as you just said, you can't guarantee a Trump administration.
Well, nobody can guarantee anything.
But he hasn't even endorsed this bill publicly.
Well, he came out with a statement just last week saying something that, you know, Ukraine was important.
No, he says everyone agrees Ukrainian survival and strength should be much more important to Europe than to us, but it's also important to us get moving Europe. That was the best that Republicans got out of him.
Well, look,
David Cameron from UK.
Let me make one other point on this.
President.
I think that we're kind of giving Joe Biden a bit of a pass on, not just as I mentioned how we got here, but the execution of the Ukraine effort. As you know, literally every major weapon system that the Ukrainians have said they need, from HIMARS, Patriots, Stingers, tanks, F-16s, now ATACMS, every single weapon system, this administration delays, because they're scared of, you know, making Vladimir Putin mad. The Senate, you saw Mark Warner there a second ago, you interviewed him. In a bipartisan way, we come in and we say, Mr. President, you have to give them these weapon systems. They finally relent. Think about where we'd be, Margaret, if, you know, a year and a half ago, we would have gotten all these weapon systems to Ukrainians.
Or 6 months ago, if Republicans in the House actually held a vote to do what they did just yesterday. But I need to move on to the climate, because I know you're also passionate about this and what the Biden administration just announced about your state of Alaska. The president wants to conserve 30% of U.S. lands as part of his climate change efforts. And he has limited oil and gas drilling in parts of the National Petroleum Reserve to protect polar bears and other things. And then he also blocked a road, crucial to operating a copper and zinc mine. You said this is suicidal and lawless.
It was.
Those are strong words.
Well, it's lawless. He doesn't have the authority to do it, and I could go into all the laws that support me on that. It's, as I say, national security suicide. Look, this president won't sanction the Iranian oil and gas regime. You may have seen Senator Blumenthal and I sent a letter to the president on Friday saying you need to do that, but he has no problem sanctioning Alaska. This administration has issued 63 executive orders and executive actions singularly focused on Alaska to shut our state down. Now, that, of course, hurts my constituents, but Margaret, a national resources, energy, critical minerals, that's an American strength. This should concern all kinds of Americans. And I'll mention one final thing that I really wanted to highlight here. You know, I've been in the Senate 9 years. I have never seen such a cynical and dishonest display coming out of any presidency. When this president on Friday with Secretary Haaland announced that they did this because the Alaska Native, the indigenous people on the North Slope of Alaska asked them to, they wanted them to. The leaders of the North Slope of Alaska were unanimous in opposition to this. They tried to meet with Secretary Haaland. She wouldn't meet with them. This is a rule that focuses on their lands where
Yes.
they've been living for thousands of years. And then the president says, well, I did it because the indigenous people of Alaska wanted it. That is a lie. And
Wow.
it is a lie. And go see what the indigenous people of Alaska from that part of my state said.
Okay.
They're very upset, and the president was
there's some-
canceling their voices and now stealing their voices. It was really a despicable move.
Well, Senator, we have to leave it there because of the break, but I know you could talk with me on this perhaps again in the future.
Thank you.
More in depth. We'll be right back. We turn now to Oklahoma Republican Congressman Tom Cole. Good morning.
Morning.
So you were the lead sponsor on Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan bills. And I know this was a big decision for the Speaker to hold the vote at all. The Polish Prime Minister tweeted, "Speaker Johnson, thank you. Better late than too late. And I hope it is not too late for Ukraine." How do you measure the cost of inaction over the past 6 months?
Well, first of all, the Senate only passed the bill 65 days ago. And it's not like the Speaker didn't have other things to do. He had to get all the appropriations done.
This is an emergency. They were running out of ammunition.
You know, and well,
When they
again, the administration waited a while. The Senate took a while. And we had other business underway. But it got done in a bipartisan way. He showed incredible leadership. And frankly, he gave us a rule, that is the structure in which we considered all these different matters, where every single member got to vote the way they wanted to on every single issue. That wasn't the case in the Senate. I think actually when they follow the example we have, you'll see more support for Ukraine than we probably saw in their original vote.
But to be fair, we're not talking about a policy debate that doesn't have a direct impact on the battlefield. I mean, the Supreme Allied Commander testified before Congress on April 10th, Ukrainians are being outshot by the Russian side 5-1 because of this debate.
Well,
the delay.
I'm sorry, democracy is kind of a messy business. And the reality is it's done. So it moved through. It moved through on a very bipartisan basis.
More Republicans voted against it than voted for it.
Well, look, it's about an even split. And quite frankly, if you want to look at the hardcore Republican opposition, go to the motion to recommit or look at the bill to strip funding from Ukraine. It's about 2-1, actually 3-1 on the motion to recommit. This is politics. There is such a thing as a vote no, hope yes crowd in every caucus. I can go down that list and tell you the members that said, okay, you got the votes, you don't need me. So I think there's
That'd be a
actually
fun
much
game
more. It is a fun game. And look, it's politics. I'm not critical of anybody. The reality is we have overwhelming bipartisan support for each part of this package. It was structured in a way that it allowed members to both make the points they wanted to make and, frankly, if they needed political cover, do it. But it got done. So I'm pretty proud of the Speaker.
Well, I want to talk to you more on the other side of this break, but just you are in there acknowledging when you say vote no, hope yes, that there were Republicans who had to vote no because of the political pressure and the fight within your own party.
It's not, again, people
who wanted it to
You
pass?
think nobody makes political calculations in the United States Senate or in the administration?
Yeah.
Welcome to American politics. But the point is, look at the numbers. Look at overwhelming bipartisan numbers.
We're going to do that
over and over.
On the other side of this break. Stay here, please.
Got it.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to continue our conversation now with Oklahoma Republican Congressman Tom Cole. Congressman, before the break, we've been talking about this vote the House had yesterday to approve the $95 billion package. There was a decision here for Speaker Johnson that was an important one. He basically put his job on the line. As we know, there's this movement among House conservatives led by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene to try to oust him from power, in part because this Ukraine aid bill. Do you think this is a real threat to his leadership?
Well, I take anything seriously, but no, I don't. Look, I think it's a relatively small number of Republican members, frankly, just as it was in McCarthy's case. There were only 8 people.
Exactly.
But the point is, I don't think there's unified Democratic support. There was unified Democratic support to remove the Speaker. I think both sides have now seen how dangerous this is, how irresponsible it is. And quite frankly, I think it's unlikely that Democrats who supported Ukraine, not as many supported Israel as we would have liked, but they did support Ukraine. I think they're unlikely to remove the Speaker over that. though, to be fair, they removed McCarthy after he did what he asked them to do, which was keep the government funded. But again, I don't think that's going to happen in this case. But if somebody wants to do it, it's within the rules, and they can take their shot.
But what you're saying there is that Democrats you trust would protect Speaker Johnson from being ousted because
frankly,
they wouldn't vote.
I don't think you'd lose very many Republicans. We didn't lose very many Republicans with McCarthy. So it doesn't take very many Democrats to either not vote or oppose it. And frankly, I don't think we'd lose the same number of Republicans that we lost with Kevin McCarthy. I think even people that disagree with the Speaker...
You wouldn't get to 8 Republicans.
I don't think so. Look, I
think
there's a lot of people that like this Speaker, that respect this Speaker, even when they disagree with him. They know he's honest, he's a straight shooter. They also had a taste of what it's like to go without a Speaker for 3 weeks. I don't think they want that again. I certainly don't think they want it close to an election.
Former Speaker Gingrich said the demons that Matt Gaetz unleashed by going after Kevin McCarthy are still out there. You can't govern by shooting yourself in the head every day. How does Speaker Johnson get anything done?
Well, first of all, he just got a lot done. He's gotten every appropriations bill passed. He's gotten FISA through. He just got this consequential.
But he has to rely on Democratic votes, which he's being
that's fine.
faulted for by members of
honestly,
his party.
No, every appropriations bill is bipartisan at the end of the day. They just work that way. So most of these things, and something like FISA ought to be bipartisan. I actually think he's, empowered the center and marginalized the extremes on each side. Now, is there some risk with that? Sure. But the point is, he's gotten a lot done. I think people admire him. They genuinely like him. They all respect him. Every single Republican voted for him. I don't think that any other person could have done that at the time other than Mike Johnson. So the reservoir of goodwill is enormous. I think he's much stronger than the people seem to think. And I think he's demonstrated that by what he's passed.
First of all, do you think Republicans after November will have the majority?
I
and
do.
If so, he could be reelected.
I do, because I think we're likely to win the presidency. I think this is pretty simple. I used to do politics for a living. I guess I still do. But the reality is the person that wins the presidency is probably going to take the House. It's close enough that probably makes a difference. I think we'll win. So I think we will have the House.
All right. Congressman, good to have you here.
Great privilege. Thank you.
In person. We'll be right back. Overnight, Israeli Defense Forces launched a deadly series of airstrikes on the city of Rafah in southern Gaza. But there's also been an uptick of violence in the West Bank. Our Deborah Patta reports.
Every 10 minutes, a child is killed in Gaza, says the United Nations. That's nearly 15,000 children in almost 7 months. Here, paramedics rushed to save the injured after yet another Israeli airstrike in Rafah. For this little girl, it was too late. Her grief-stricken father is inconsolable. He is not alone. In this room, there are only the bodies of children. Overnight, at least 10 more names added to that endless list of horror, the youngest just 2 years old. Our CBS News team in Gaza reports that among the dead was a pregnant woman. Miraculously, doctors saved her baby girl. Here, Israel Defense Force soldiers prepare for a mission. But this is not in Gaza. It's IDF footage of a 2-day operation in the West Bank city of Tulkarem, where they say they have been rooting out militants. At least 14 Palestinians were killed.
The IDF pulled out last night, leaving this massive destruction in its wake. It's on a scale residents say they've never seen before.
This morning, they were mopping up the damage. Israeli soldiers used bulldozers to smash through the area, destroying streets, buildings and infrastructure. The West Bank has reached boiling point. Nearly 500 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and there are ongoing clashes with Israeli settlers, which escalated after a 14-year-old settler was found dead over a week ago. The U.S. has imposed new sanctions on West Bank settlers, and a U.S. official told CBS News that since 2022, it's been investigating an IDF unit of ultra-Orthodox soldiers accused of human rights atrocities, with an announcement expected this week.
The unit is stationed here in the West Bank. Media reports suggesting it could be blacklisted from receiving U.S. military aid prompted an angry outburst from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said any sanctions imposed on the IDF would be a moral low when it is fighting in Gaza.
That was our Deborah Patta. And we're joined now by New York Times White House and national security correspondent David Sanger. His latest book, New Cold Wars, is out now. David, good to see you again.
Great to be with you, Margaret.
Where do we begin? The world truly is on fire. And one of the things I like about your book is you write, going all the way back to listening to the Nixon-Kennedy debates and hearing those candidates hash out America's role in the world and geostrategy. In this election, we don't even know if the candidates will have a debate. Meanwhile, the world's on fire. How do the members of the American public need to think about the global competition the United States is in the middle of?
Well, it's a very different competition than what we had in the Cold War. You know, those Nixon-Kennedy debates were, at the height of the moment of a U.S. contest against the Soviet Union, which was terrifying and nuclear. But there was a simplicity about it. There was a predictability about it. We understood who controlled their nuclear weapons. They understood who controlled ours. We knew who to call. The new Cold Wars are quite different, Margaret. We've got Russia and China coming together in a periodic partnership. I wouldn't say it's a full alliance. We have other players like Iran and North Korea, as you were discussing with our earlier guests, supplying them, becoming sort of what the Iranians call an axis of resistance to the U.S. It is a far more volatile, I think far more dangerous period than we had even then. And yet, as you point out, our ability to discuss it as a nation has somewhat degraded. You watch those Kennedy-Nixon debates and put aside who was sweating and who looked young and vigorous and all that. It was an incredibly sophisticated argument, largely about nuclear deterrence. I'm afraid that we're not having that incredibly sophisticated argument today, 60 years, more than 60 years later. But the vote yesterday, which you've been discussing about Ukraine, at the end of the day, turned out to be a fairly overwhelming vote in favor of the U.S. pushing against the Russians in Ukraine and perhaps beyond.
Certainly overwhelmingly yes for Democrats, a bit split for
a majority of Republicans voted against, but
yes.
it passed comfortably.
It did. And I think it's such an interesting point you make, though, in sort of changing how we think about competition with Russia and China. We learned Friday that the U.S. is likely to lose a significant counterterrorism base in the African country of Niger because the government demanded troops withdraw. I think a lot of Americans didn't even know that there were 1,000 U.S. troops there fighting or working in the counterterrorism space. Russia's moving in.
That's right.
China is getting and carving out a large amount of influence in Africa. What are the fronts in the new Cold War?
Well, there are a couple of different ones. You point out one in Africa, also an area that China has been wiring up with Huawei equipment and so forth. So we are concerned, rightly so, that the U.S., in not having a competitor straight on to put in 5G equipment, may be losing the opportunity to help bind the continent together. In the book, I take you to the Solomon Islands, a place the U.S. fought for in World War II and scored a big victory, but now has basically moved over into China's camp. There's still some contest underway. But to answer your question more broadly, if you believe that there is something of a new Iron Curtain coming down, a place where you're going to divide the U.S., the NATO nations against China, Russia, Iran, others, it's somewhere in that borderland between Ukraine and Russia. And that's why the bill that went through Congress was so important. I don't know if it's enough to turn the tide. The Ukrainians may have lost so much time and ammunition here that it may be too late. But certainly had it not passed, that was pretty much by the judgment of the CIA director, Bill Burns, and others, going to be the end of the contest. The Russians almost certainly would have surged forward.
And China has made clear they have a stake in Russia winning in Ukraine. It is.
That's right.
This
And
competition.
if we had those debates again, and as you say, who knows if we will? I think the most interesting,
or even those interviews,
or even that's right,
substantial interviews with conversations about national security interests of America. I mean,
that's right. And
we should.
And President Biden has been reluctant to have major sit-down interviews, at least with the print organizations. But I think if we did have those interviews, I think one of the big questions is, what is your plan to get in the midst of the Russia-China combination?
Yeah.
Because the core of what Nixon and Kissinger were doing in the early 70s in recognizing China was to prevent Russia and China from coming together.
You also make this interesting point about the dynamic that's so different given, first of all, they're so economically intertwined, the United States and China, but also the business community and technology and the role it plays in this version of competition. A top U.S. cyber official told you companies, not the U.S. government, have all the insight these days. How do we know when an attack's coming?
Yeah, the book opens with the days running up to the war in Ukraine. And while there were certainly lots of indicators coming from American satellites and signals intelligence and so forth, in the end, one of the key indicators that the Russians were getting ready to roll came from Microsoft, whose engineers were noticing that malware that had been placed by the Russians on Ukrainian government agencies were being activated and sent a notice through their channels that ultimately went to the White House. At the end of the day, what kept Ukraine running was some combination of Microsoft and Amazon moving all of their data to the cloud, and then Elon Musk coming in and providing Starlink so they could communicate to that cloud.
Incredible.
Something we never saw in the old Cold Wars.
David, it's a fascinating read. It's good to see you in person, and we'll have to leave it there.
Thank you.
Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro is standing by waiting for us. We'll be right back. We go now to the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. He joins us this morning from Abington, Pennsylvania. And Governor, thank you for sticking with us. We've been having some transmission technical issues, so hopefully we don't get interrupted. I'll get straight to it.
I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
I'll get straight to it, Governor. You have been outspoken against the rising and troubling anti-Semitism in this country. I know the FBI director said just a few days ago that federal law enforcement is concerned about lone actors targeting gatherings ahead of the start of Passover, which starts tomorrow. Are there known threats in your state?
Well, there's not known threats right now, and I can tell you the Pennsylvania State Police, working in coordination with our federal and local partners, are all over this, and will let folks know in communities if there are specific threats. But we continue to work closely with law enforcement and community leaders to do everything we can to take down the temperature, to address the rise in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, other forms of hate. There should be no place for that here in Pennsylvania. Of course, Pennsylvania founded on the vision of William Penn, a place that would be a place of tolerance and welcome and peace, a place where people could come together and practice their faith, whatever their faith is. We have a special relationship with that here in this Commonwealth, where we respect all, no matter what you look like, where you come from, who you love, or who you choose to pray to. And we're going to continue to do everything we can to make sure everyone feels protected in this Commonwealth.
Well, there should be no place for it anywhere in America, and I know you agree with that. Let me get to the politics of the moment. President Biden won the state of Pennsylvania in 2020 narrowly. He spent a lot of time in your state this past week. We've seen in our polling his approval rating among young voters aged 18 to 29 has dropped 12 points since February, from 55% to 43% today. How does the president get that back?
I think the president gets it back by doing exactly what he's doing, showing up, talking about his record, addressing things like climate change, which are incredibly important issues for young voters, along with many others, obviously. Making sure that young people feel included in the conversation, not just as a vote, but as part of the governing coalition going forward. Young people helped propel me to victory as governor. One of the first things I did was start what I believe is the first ever Next Gen Engagement Commission here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a place where young people quite literally advise me on policy, meet with me regularly, give me their perspective on what's happening in the community. I think part of the frustration by young people is that they oftentimes don't feel heard. They feel like their voices and their votes are taken advantage of come election time. This is a moment where the young people deserve to be at the table. And the fact that the president's showing up in these communities and talking about these issues that are going to help young people in the future, I think is a really important step.
So last weekend, Donald Trump was campaigning in Pennsylvania. It's so key. Here's what he said.
Biden has imposed a savage natural gas export ban that's putting countless Pennsylvania jobs at risk. He's risking your lives. He's risking your jobs. But he doesn't care because all he cares about is the Green New Scam.
He is speaking to real fear among some of your constituents about President Biden's decision to, at least temporarily, put a pause on new natural gas projects. How do you respond to that?
Look, I've been very clear with the White House and publicly. I hope that this pause that they put in place is very quick and then we move forward. Here in Pennsylvania, our energy economy has powered this nation, and it has done so over many generations. And going forward, I think Pennsylvania has an opportunity to be the center of the clean energy economy. Thanks to the president, we're the only state in the nation with 2 regional hydrogen hubs.
But
Thanks to the president, we've been able to work together.
Sorry, you broke up at the beginning. I think you said you've been very clear to the White House that you hope this is a short pause. Does that mean you agree it is costing your state jobs and money?
Well, I think if the pause goes on for a long time, it has the potential to cost us jobs. That's why I want this to be as quick as possible. And what I went on to say, though, is we have an opportunity here in Pennsylvania to be the center of the clean energy economy. Thanks to President Biden, we have 2 regional hydrogen hubs. Thanks to President Biden, we are capping methane emissions from abandoned wells. We have billions of dollars of tax credits and other resources coming from the Department of Energy to help us through a transition. Here in Pennsylvania, we're showing that we can both protect the jobs that exist today and create more energy jobs tomorrow. Energy is critical to the future of our Commonwealth. Now listen, the bravado and the bluster from the former president do nothing to actually create jobs in Pennsylvania. He's got an abysmal track record when it comes to that. President Biden has a strong record, and we're going to continue to lead on energy here in Pennsylvania.
You mentioned young voters and how key the issue of climate is to them. The Biden administration touts the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, as a green energy bill, even though it wasn't named that. But CBS polling shows half of Americans have not heard much or nothing at all about what the administration has done. Only 14% say they've heard a lot. 2/3 don't know if their state has gotten federal funds for climate change projects. This seems a real vulnerability for Democrats when it comes to young voters.
Let me be very clear. Climate change is real, it is serious, and we have to address it. And Joe Biden understands that. Donald Trump has made fun of climate change and denies its existence. So there's a clear contrast in this race because of the federal dollars that have flowed to Pennsylvania. As I mentioned a moment ago, we are positioned to get 2 regional hydrogen hubs that are going to help us combat climate change. We're addressing all kinds of infrastructure needs here in this Commonwealth, from repairing roads and bridges to making sure people are connected to the internet, to making sure families in Esplin, which is a predominantly minority community in Pittsburgh, no longer need to drink water out of the lines that contain lead, thanks to Joe Biden cleaning that up. So when it comes to infrastructure investments, when it comes to the kind of investments that are going to help spur on a clean energy economy, President Biden has been there. Now, we have to make that case, and we've got to make sure folks understand that and hear that. That's why you run a campaign. That's why you'll see stark differences when it comes to combating climate change between the policies of President Biden and what Donald Trump has done in the past and wants to do in the future.
But the messaging needs work. is what you're saying.
Well, I think the case needs to be made. There's a wonderful track record. There's a wonderful body of work. They need to make that case, and I'll be helping make that case alongside the president.
I want to ask about something that has been really damaging your state, and that is drug addiction. Pennsylvania has, the #1 public health crisis in Pennsylvania, according to the state, is opioids. The CDC says Pennsylvania recently saw the highest number of xylazine-related deaths in the country. What is driving the addiction?
Listen, 13 Pennsylvanians die every single day from an opioid overdose. It is unacceptable. And here in Pennsylvania, we're trying to come at it with a multi-pronged approach. First, we have to understand that drug addiction is a disease, not a crime. Now, we have to invest in law enforcement, and we've increased the number of state troopers by 400, and I'm looking to add another 400. As Attorney General, I arrested over 8,000 drug dealers. So we're not going soft on those who are peddling these poisons in our community. But we also have to make sure the treatment is available. As Attorney General, I led a national coalition that ended up holding those drug companies accountable. The very people that brought this crisis into our communities and brought $2 billion back to Pennsylvania for treatment. This is really critical stuff, and it's going to require a multi-pronged approach.
I'm sorry I have to interrupt you. We have to leave it there, Governor. Thank you. We'll be back.